The applause started slowly, scattered and confused, as my name echoed through the grand ballroom of the American College of Surgeons annual conference. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Surgeon of the Year. The same male doctors who had been snickering during my presentation just hours earlier were now rising to their feet, one by one, their faces a mixture of shock and reluctant respect. But this moment of vindication was 3 years in the making, and it started in the most unlikely place imaginable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm 38 years old. 3 years ago, I was the head of cardiothoracic surgery at Metropolitan General Hospital in Chicago, Illinois. Today, as I write this, I'm the youngest woman ever to receive the Surgeon of the Year award from the American College of Surgeons. But the journey between those 2 points nearly broke me in ways I never imagined possible. I had always been different from my colleagues at Metropolitan General. While they bonded over golf games and expensive whiskey, I spent my free time developing new surgical techniques in the simulation lab. While they attended pharmaceutical company dinners and networking events, I was in my home office, writing research papers that pushed the boundaries of cardiovascular medicine. My background wasn't typical for someone in my position. I grew up in East Los Angeles, the daughter of a mechanic and a school cafeteria worker. My parents, Miguel and Carmen Vasquez, had immigrated from Mexico with nothing but determination and the belief that education could change everything. They worked double shifts to put me through medical school, and I graduated summa cum laude from UCLA before completing my residency at Johns Hopkins. By age 35, I had pioneered 3 revolutionary surgical procedures that had saved hundreds of lives. My minimally invasive technique for repairing complex aortic aneurysms had a 98% success rate, compared to the traditional approach, which averaged around 85%. My work on pediatric heart valve replacement had reduced recovery times by 60%. Most significantly, I had developed a groundbreaking method for treating previously inoperable heart conditions in elderly patients, giving hope to families who had been told there were no options left. But success in surgery, I learned, isn't just about saving lives. It's about politics, personalities, and fitting into systems that weren't designed for people like me. The problem started when Dr. Harrison Blake became chief of surgery 2 years into my tenure as department head. Blake was everything I wasn't. A tall, imposing man from a family of prominent Boston physicians, someone who had never had to prove his worth because his last name opened every door. He had graduated from Harvard Medical School not because of exceptional grades, but because his grandfather had endowed the cardiology wing. During our first department meeting, Blake made his priorities clear. We need to focus on procedures that generate revenue and maintain our reputation with referring physicians. Some of the more experimental approaches we've been pursuing may be innovative, but they're creating unnecessary risks and complications. He was referring to my techniques, though he was too diplomatic to say so directly. The unnecessary risks he mentioned were actually my attempts to save patients that other surgeons had written off as untreatable. The complications were the longer surgical times required for my more precise methods that resulted in better outcomes but lower profit margins. The changes started subtly. Blake began assigning the most complex cases to Dr. Richard Crane and Dr. Michael Torres, 2 surgeons who had been passed over for the department head position when I was hired. Both were competent doctors, but neither had my track record of innovation or my success rates with high-risk patients. Elena, I think it would be beneficial for you to focus on the routine procedures, Blake explained during one of our weekly meetings. Your attention to detail is excellent for standard bypasses and valve replacements. Let's leave the experimental cases to surgeons with more traditional training. The condescension in his voice was barely concealed. Traditional training, in Blake's mind, meant learning surgery the way it had been done for decades, without questioning established methods or developing new approaches. Innovation, to him, was a threat to the established order. I watched as patients who could have benefited from my techniques were assigned to surgeons who used outdated methods. Mrs. Rodriguez, an 82-year-old woman with a complex aortic aneurysm, underwent a traditional open chest procedure that left her hospitalized for 3 weeks. Had Blake allowed me to perform my minimally invasive technique, she would have been home within 5 days with a much lower risk of complications. 7-year-old Marcus Thompson needed a pediatric valve replacement that I had performed successfully dozens of times. Instead, Blake assigned the case to Dr. Crane, who used a conventional approach that required 2 additional surgeries and left the child with permanent limitations on physical activity. Each reassignment felt like a personal betrayal, but more importantly, it felt like a betrayal of the patients who deserved the best possible care. I began documenting every case, every outcome, and every instance where my techniques could have provided better results. While Blake was systematically marginalizing my role in complex surgeries, I threw myself into research with an intensity that bordered on obsession. If I couldn't save lives in the operating room, I would develop techniques that could transform how surgery was performed worldwide. I spent 18 months developing what I called the precision protocol, a combination of advanced imaging, robotic assistance, and minimally invasive techniques that could treat heart conditions previously considered inoperable. The protocol involved using real-time 3D cardiac mapping, combined with micro-robotic instruments to perform surgery through incisions smaller than a coin. The breakthrough came when I successfully treated Maria Santos, a 45-year-old mother of 3, who had been told by 4 different cardiac surgeons that her condition was untreatable. She had a rare combination of valve defects and arterial malformations that made traditional surgery impossible. Using my precision protocol, I was able to complete the repair in 3 hours with virtually no scarring and a recovery time of just 2 weeks. The case should have been groundbreaking. Instead, Blake buried it in administrative paperwork and refused to allow me to present the results at medical conferences. The hospital's legal department has concerns about experimental procedures, he explained, though no such concerns had been raised when Dr. Crane had attempted a far riskier traditional surgery the previous month. We need to be conservative with our approach until we have more data. More data meant more patients, and more patients meant being allowed to perform the procedures Blake was systematically preventing me from doing. It was a catch-22, designed to keep innovation from threatening the status quo. The night everything changed started like any other emergency call. At 2:47 a.m., my pager buzzed with a trauma alert. Multi-vehicle accident, 34-year-old male, massive cardiac trauma, ETA, 5 minutes. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics wheeled in David Chen, a software engineer and father of 2 young children. He had been driving home from his daughter's school play when a drunk driver ran a red light and hit his car at 60 miles per hour. The impact had caused massive trauma to his heart, a combination of injuries that would require immediate surgery and perfect execution to save his life. Dr. Crane was the attending surgeon on call, but when he assessed the damage, his prognosis was grim. "The trauma is too extensive," he told David's wife Sarah, who had arrived at the hospital in tears. "We can attempt surgery, but honestly, the chances of survival are less than 20%. Even if he survives the operation, he'll likely have severe limitations for the rest of his life." I had been observing from the trauma bay, and I could see immediately that Crane was approaching the case with traditional methods that would never work for this type of injury. David's heart had sustained damage in 3 separate areas, and conventional surgery would require stopping his heart for over 2 hours, a duration that virtually guaranteed permanent brain damage even if he survived. But using my precision protocol, I could repair all 3 areas simultaneously through minimal incisions, reducing the surgery time to under 90 minutes and dramatically improving his chances of a full recovery. "Dr. Crane," I said quietly, "I'd like to suggest an alternative approach." He turned to me with barely concealed irritation. "Dr. Vasquez, this is a trauma case, not an experimental research project. We need to proceed with established protocols." "The established protocols are going to kill him," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "I can save this man's life with a complete recovery, but only if we use the precision protocol." "Absolutely not. The legal liability alone would end both our careers. We're proceeding with standard trauma surgery." I watched as David's vital signs continued to deteriorate. His blood pressure was dropping and his heart rhythm was becoming increasingly erratic. In 15 minutes, he would be beyond saving regardless of which surgical approach we used. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. "Sarah," I said, approaching David's wife in the family waiting area, I need to explain your husband's condition and his options. I spent 10 minutes describing exactly what had happened to David's heart, what conventional surgery could and couldn't accomplish, and what my alternative approach might achieve. I explained the risks, the potential benefits, and the reality that choosing my method would mean going against hospital protocol. "Dr. Vasquez," Sarah said, gripping my hands with tears streaming down her face, "will your way give him the best chance to come home to our children?" "Yes," I replied without hesitation. "But I need you to understand that if you choose this option, I'll be performing surgery without approval from my superiors. If something goes wrong, my career will be over. And if we don't choose your option, your husband will likely die tonight or survive with such severe limitations that he'll never be the same person you married." Sarah looked through the window at David, unconscious on the gurney with machines keeping him alive. "Do whatever you think is best. Save my husband." I spent the next hour performing the most precise, technically demanding surgery of my career. Using my precision protocol, I repaired David's heart through 3 small incisions, each no larger than a quarter. The robotic instruments allowed me to work with millimeter precision, repairing damage that would have been impossible to address with traditional methods. The surgery was a complete success. David's heart function returned to normal, his recovery was ahead of schedule, and within a week he was home playing with his children as if nothing had happened. But my victory came with a price that I hadn't fully anticipated. Dr. Blake called me into his office the following morning, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Dr. Vasquez, you performed an unauthorized experimental procedure on a trauma patient without departmental approval, without legal clearance, and without following established protocols. I saved a man's life using a technique that provided better outcomes than conventional surgery," I replied. "David Chen is going home to his family instead of dying or living with permanent disability. That's not the point. You violated hospital policy, put the institution at legal risk, and undermined the authority of the attending surgeon. This kind of insubordination cannot be tolerated." Blake slid a document across his desk. "You're being suspended pending a full investigation by the Medical Review Board. Until further notice, you're prohibited from performing surgery, seeing patients, or participating in any clinical activities." I stared at the suspension papers, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. "You're suspending me for saving a patient's life?" "I'm suspending you for reckless endangerment, violation of hospital protocols, and professional misconduct. The review board will determine whether you're fit to continue practicing medicine at this institution." As I cleaned out my office that afternoon, packing away research papers, surgical awards, and photos of patients whose lives I had saved, I felt a crushing weight of injustice that threatened to overwhelm me. I had spent my entire career developing techniques that saved lives, only to be punished for using them when it mattered most. But as I drove home that evening, passing the hospital where I had spent the last 5 years of my life, I made a decision that would define everything that followed. If Metropolitan General didn't value innovation, if they preferred politics to patient outcomes, then I would find a place that did. Or better yet, I would create it myself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. That night, as I sat in my home office surrounded by research papers and surgical journals, I began developing a plan that would change not just my career but the entire field of cardiovascular surgery. If the medical establishment wanted to suppress innovation, I would prove that excellence couldn't be hidden forever. I would spend the next 2 years documenting every case, every technique, and every outcome that demonstrated the superiority of my approaches. I would build a portfolio of evidence so compelling that no medical board in the country could ignore it. Most importantly, I would prepare for the moment when the medical community would have to acknowledge that merit matters more than politics, that patient outcomes matter more than hospital profits, and that the best surgeon isn't always the one who follows orders without question. I had no idea that moment would come at the American College of Surgeons annual conference, where the same doctors who had dismissed my work would be forced to watch as I received the highest honor in our profession. But first, I had to survive the review board, rebuild my career from scratch, and prove that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from the doctors who refuse to accept that "this is how we've always done it" is a good enough reason to let patients die. The fight for my profession, my patients, and my future was just beginning. And I intended to win. The medical review board hearing took place on a gray Thursday morning in November, in a sterile conference room that felt more like a courtroom than a place where patient care should be discussed. 7 doctors sat behind a mahogany table, their faces impassive as they reviewed the charges against me: violation of hospital protocol, unauthorized experimental surgery, and professional misconduct. Dr. Harrison Blake sat at the far end of the table, presenting his case with the calm authority of someone who had never had his decisions questioned. Dr. Vasquez's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, represent a dangerous precedent, he testified. If we allow surgeons to ignore established protocols whenever they disagree with attending physician decisions, we undermine the entire structure of medical hierarchy that keeps our patients safe. What he didn't mention was that David Chen had made a complete recovery. What he didn't discuss was that my experimental procedure had achieved results that conventional surgery never could have accomplished. What he carefully avoided was any mention of the fact that my innovation had saved a man's life while traditional methods would have failed. I sat silently through 4 hours of testimony that painted me as a reckless maverick who put personal ambition ahead of patient safety. When they finally allowed me to speak, I faced 7 skeptical faces and realized that this wasn't really about David Chen or surgical protocols. This was about whether the medical establishment was ready to embrace innovation, or whether they preferred the predictability of mediocrity. "Doctors," I began, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to say. "I became a surgeon to save lives, not to follow procedures that guarantee failure. The choice I made that night wasn't between following rules and breaking them. It was between letting a patient die and giving him the chance to live." The review board deliberated for 3 days. When they finally delivered their verdict, it came with conditions that would fundamentally change my relationship with medicine. I could return to practice, but only under strict supervision. Any innovative procedures would require pre-approval from a committee of senior physicians. My research activities would be limited to approved protocols only. They were offering me the chance to become exactly the kind of surgeon I had never wanted to be. Competent but constrained, capable but conventional. I accepted their terms, knowing I had no choice. But I also made a private decision that would define the next chapter of my career. I would use their restrictions to build something they could never take away from me. Returning to Metropolitan General after the suspension felt like entering a parallel universe, where everything looked familiar, but nothing worked the same way. My former colleagues treated me with polite professionalism, tinged with underlying suspicion. Nurses who had once sought my opinion on complex cases now directed their questions to other surgeons. Medical students who had competed for rotation spots in my department were quietly steered toward more stable mentorship opportunities. Dr. Blake assigned me to the least challenging cases: routine bypass surgeries, standard valve replacements, and procedures that any competent surgeon could perform with their eyes closed. The message was clear: stay in your lane, don't innovate, and slowly fade into medical obscurity. But what Blake didn't understand was that even performing routine surgeries with superior technique would teach me lessons that traditional approaches never could. Every case became a laboratory for refinement, every patient an opportunity to perfect methods that I knew would eventually revolutionize cardiac surgery. Mrs. Eleanor Hamilton, a 67-year-old retired teacher, came to me for a standard aortic valve replacement. According to hospital protocol, she should have undergone a traditional sternotomy, a procedure that would require breaking her ribs, stopping her heart for over an hour, and leaving her with a recovery period of 6 to 8 weeks. Instead, I performed the replacement using modified minimally invasive techniques that I had been developing in secret. The surgery took 45 minutes, required only a small incision, and had Mrs. Hamilton walking around the hospital the next day. "Dr. Vasquez," she said as I checked on her before discharge. "The other surgeons said I'd be in the hospital for a week and unable to drive for 2 months. I feel better now than I did before the surgery. How is that possible?" I smiled, adjusting her chart and making notes about her remarkable recovery. Sometimes the best medicine is simply being very careful about how we approach each individual case. What I didn't tell her was that I had spent 3 months developing a modified approach specifically for her anatomy, using advanced imaging techniques to plan every aspect of the surgery before making the first incision. What I couldn't explain was that innovation doesn't disappear just because administrators try to suppress it. It goes underground, becomes more refined, and emerges stronger than before. My real education during this period took place after hours, in the surgical simulation lab that few doctors bothered to use after completing their residencies. While my colleagues attended medical conferences and networking events, I spent nights and weekends perfecting techniques that pushed the boundaries of what cardiac surgery could accomplish. The lab had state-of-the-art equipment that could simulate any cardiac condition, allowing surgeons to practice complex procedures without putting patients at risk. Most of the staff used it for required continuing education credits, running through standard scenarios with predictable outcomes. I used it to solve problems that hadn't been solved yet. Working with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a brilliant biomedical engineer who managed the simulation lab, I began developing what would eventually become the Vasquez protocol, a systematic approach to cardiac surgery that combined precision robotics, real-time imaging, and minimally invasive techniques to achieve outcomes that traditional surgery couldn't match. Elena, what you're doing here is 20 years ahead of current practice, Sarah told me one evening as we reviewed data from our latest simulation. These techniques could transform how cardiac surgery is performed worldwide. That's the idea, I replied, studying the results that showed 40% shorter surgery times and 60% faster recovery periods compared to conventional methods. But first, I need to prove that they work consistently, with every type of patient and every type of condition. Sarah and I spent 18 months documenting every simulation, every technique, and every improvement. We created a comprehensive database that demonstrated not just that innovative approaches worked, but why they worked better than traditional methods. More importantly, we identified the specific scenarios where conventional surgery failed and where our approaches succeeded. Elderly patients with multiple comorbidities, children with complex congenital defects, emergency trauma cases where time was the difference between life and death. We weren't just developing new techniques. We were building the foundation for a complete transformation of cardiac surgery. While Dr. Blake and his colleagues focused on hospital politics and revenue optimization, I was achieving results that should have been impossible under their restrictive supervision. Every patient I treated using modified techniques had shorter recovery times, fewer complications, and better long-term outcomes than hospital averages. The improvements were subtle enough to avoid triggering administrative attention, but significant enough to create a growing reputation among nurses, residents, and the few attending physicians who paid attention to patient outcomes rather than procedural compliance. Dr. James Rodriguez, a second-year resident, approached me one afternoon with questions about a complex case he was observing. Dr. Vasquez, I've been watching your surgeries, and your patients seem to recover much faster than average. Are you doing something different? I considered my response carefully. Direct teaching of innovative techniques would violate my review board restrictions, but answering honest questions about surgical principles was still within bounds. What differences have you observed? I asked, using the Socratic method to guide his learning without explicitly revealing my modifications. Your incisions are smaller, but somehow you achieve better visualization. Your surgery times are shorter, but the repairs look more precise. Your patients have less pain postoperatively, but you're not, using different medications. Those are excellent observations. What do you think might explain those differences? Over the following weeks, James began developing his own understanding of advanced surgical principles through careful observation and thoughtful questions. He started requesting assignments in my cases, and his own surgical skills improved dramatically as he learned to think beyond conventional approaches. I was training the next generation of innovative surgeons without technically violating any restrictions by teaching them to observe, question, and think critically about established practices. The most important work I did during this period wasn't surgery at all. It was creating an irrefutable record of what innovative cardiac surgery could accomplish. Every case, every technique, and every outcome was meticulously documented with video recordings, detailed surgical notes, and comprehensive follow-up data. I was building a portfolio that would eventually prove that excellence in medicine isn't about following established protocols. It's about constantly seeking better ways to heal patients and save lives. Working with Sarah Martinez and a small team of progressive residents, I created detailed case studies that compared traditional approaches with innovative techniques across hundreds of patients. The data was overwhelming. Minimally invasive methods resulted in 50% shorter hospital stays, 70% fewer complications, and 90% higher patient satisfaction scores. More importantly, we documented dozens of cases where traditional surgery would have failed completely, but innovative approaches achieved full recovery. Patients who had been told they were too high risk for surgery were walking out of the hospital within days, returning to normal activities within weeks instead of months. "Elena, this isn't just incremental improvement," Sarah observed as we reviewed our comprehensive data analysis. "This is a fundamental breakthrough in how cardiac surgery should be performed. Why isn't this being published in every medical journal in the country?" "Because the medical establishment doesn't reward innovation," I replied. "It rewards conformity, predictability, and risk avoidance. Publishing this data would threaten too many careers built on outdated techniques." "So what's your plan?" I looked at the stack of case studies, surgical videos, and outcome data that represented 2 years of intensive work. I'm going to wait for the right moment to reveal everything. When the medical community is ready to see proof that there's a better way to practice surgery. Despite the restrictions placed on my practice, word began to spread within the medical community about my unusual results. Nurses from other departments started requesting transfers to cardiac surgery, specifically to work with me. Residents competed for rotation spots that would let them observe my techniques. Even attending physicians from other hospitals began asking casual questions about my approaches to difficult cases. Dr. Lisa Chen, chief of cardiology at Northwestern Memorial, approached me at a medical conference with curiosity that was impossible to ignore. "Elena, I've been reviewing some cases from Metropolitan General, and I noticed that patients treated by you have significantly better outcomes than the hospital average. What's your secret?" "Careful attention to individual patient needs," I replied diplomatically. "Every case is unique, and sometimes standard approaches need to be modified to achieve optimal results." "Modified how?" I spent the next hour describing general principles of precision surgery, without revealing specific techniques that would violate my review board restrictions. Lisa listened with growing excitement as I explained how advanced imaging could guide surgical planning, how robotic assistance could improve precision, and how minimally invasive approaches could reduce patient trauma. "Elena, you need to be presenting this work at national conferences. This isn't just interesting. This is revolutionary. I'm working on building a comprehensive case database," I explained. "When I present this work, I want to have irrefutable evidence that these approaches represent the future of cardiac surgery." What I didn't tell Lisa was that I was also waiting for the right opportunity to demonstrate my techniques to an audience that couldn't ignore the results. An opportunity that would force the medical establishment to acknowledge that innovation matters more than tradition, and that patient outcomes matter more than institutional politics. The case that would eventually change everything came to me on a rainy Tuesday in March, when a medical transport helicopter landed on our hospital roof carrying a patient that no surgeon in Chicago wanted to touch. Isabella Rodriguez was a 28-year-old mother of twin daughters who had been in a severe car accident. The trauma had caused massive damage to her heart, including tears in multiple chambers, damaged valves, and arterial disruption that made conventional surgery nearly impossible. 3 different cardiac surgeons had reviewed her case and reached the same conclusion: the injuries were too extensive for repair. The best they could offer was palliative care that might extend her life for a few weeks while her family said goodbye. But looking at Isabella's imaging studies, I could see possibilities that traditional approaches had missed. Her injuries were complex, but they followed patterns that my innovative techniques were specifically designed to address. Using the Vasquez protocol that I had been developing in secret, I could potentially repair all the damage through minimally invasive approaches that would allow her heart to heal naturally. The surgery would require 12 hours of the most precise work I had ever attempted, using techniques that had never been tried on trauma of this magnitude. If I succeeded, Isabella would make a complete recovery and return home to her daughters. If I failed, my career would be over, and I would be personally responsible for the death of a young mother. Standing in the corridor outside Isabella's room, watching her husband hold her hand, While their 3-year-old daughters asked why mommy wouldn't wake up, I made the decision that would define the rest of my career. I was going to save her life, regardless of the consequences. I spent 48 hours preparing for Isabella's surgery with the intensity of someone planning a mission to Mars. Every aspect of the procedure was rehearsed in the simulation lab. Every possible complication was anticipated and planned for. Every innovative technique was refined to perfection. Sarah Martinez worked alongside me, running scenarios and optimizing approaches until we had achieved consistent success in virtual surgery. Elena, the simulations show 95% probability of successful repair with complete recovery, she reported after our final practice session. But you understand that if this goes wrong, Blake will use it to destroy your career completely. And if I don't try, Isabella dies and her daughters grow up without their mother, I replied. That's not acceptable. Dr. James Rodriguez, now in his final year of residency, volunteered to assist despite knowing that associating with my experimental approach could damage his own career prospects. Dr. Vasquez, I've learned more about surgery from watching you work than from all my textbooks combined. If you think this can save her life, I want to help. 2 other residents quietly joined our team, along with 3 nurses who had been working with me for months and understood what we were attempting. We weren't just performing surgery, we were proving that innovation, preparation, and unwavering commitment to patient care could overcome any obstacle. Isabella's surgery began at 6 a.m. on a Thursday morning, in an operating room that had been configured specifically for the advanced techniques we would be using. For 12 hours, our team worked with millimeter precision, repairing damage that traditional surgery couldn't address. Using robotic instruments guided by real-time 3D imaging, we repaired tears in her heart chambers without stopping her circulation. We replaced damaged valves through incisions smaller than coins. We reconstructed arterial connections using microsurgical techniques that left her cardiovascular system stronger than it had been before the accident. At 6:17 p.m., Isabella's heart began beating with a rhythm stronger and more regular than her pre-accident baseline. Her vital signs stabilized, her circulation improved, and the monitors showed cardiac function that exceeded normal ranges. Within 24 hours, she was awake and talking to her husband. Within 48 hours, she was holding her daughters and planning her recovery. Within a week, she was home, completely healed, with no limitations on her activity and no signs of the trauma that had nearly killed her. The surgery was a complete success that demonstrated everything I had been working toward for 3 years. But more importantly, it created documentation that no medical review board could ignore or dismiss. Dr. Blake's reaction to Isabella's surgery was exactly what I had expected: fury disguised as concern for hospital protocols. Dr. Vasquez, you performed another unauthorized experimental procedure, this time on a patient that multiple surgeons had deemed inoperable. You've violated every condition of your previous agreement with the review board. I saved the life of a young mother using techniques that achieved results traditional surgery couldn't deliver, I replied calmly. Isabella Rodriguez is home with her children instead of dead, because innovation matters more than institutional politics. You're suspended immediately, pending a full investigation that will likely result in termination and loss of your medical license. As I cleaned out my office for the second time in 3 years, I felt something different than I had during my first suspension. This time, I wasn't defeated or uncertain about my future. This time, I was ready. I had spent 3 years building an irrefutable case for revolutionary approaches to cardiac surgery. I had documented hundreds of superior outcomes. I had trained a new generation of innovative surgeons. Most importantly, I had proven that excellence couldn't be suppressed forever. As I drove home that evening, carrying boxes filled with research data and surgical recordings, I made a phone call that would change everything. Dr. Chen, this is Elena Vasquez. I'm ready to present my work at the American College of Surgeons annual conference. The education phase of my career was over. The vindication phase was about to begin. They thought they could bury innovation under layers of bureaucracy and institutional politics. They believed that suppressing excellence would preserve their comfortable mediocrity. But what they didn't understand was that every restriction had made me stronger. Every obstacle had made me more determined. and every case had added to the evidence that would eventually transform cardiac surgery forever. The review board hearing would be the last time anyone questioned whether my innovations were worth the risk. Because in exactly 18 months, I would be standing before the most prestigious surgeons in America, holding an award that proved merit always triumphs over politics. But first, I had to survive the fight of my professional life. The second suspension from Metropolitan General came with a finality that my first had lacked. Dr. Blake made it clear that this time, there would be no conditions for return, no committee oversight, no restricted practice. I was being terminated, and he would personally ensure that my medical license was revoked for what he termed a pattern of dangerous experimental behavior that puts patients at unnecessary risk. What Blake didn't understand was that by forcing me completely out of the institutional system, he had just given me the one thing I needed most: absolute freedom to innovate without constraints. Standing in my empty office for the last time, surrounded by boxes containing 3 years of revolutionary research, I felt something I hadn't experienced since medical school: the exhilarating terror of unlimited possibility. For the first time in my career, no one could tell me which surgeries to perform, which techniques to use, or which innovations to suppress. I was about to become everything the medical establishment feared most: a surgeon with nothing to lose and everything to prove. Dr. Lisa Chen's offer came exactly 1 week after my termination from Metropolitan General. As chief of cardiology at Northwestern Memorial, she had been quietly observing my work for months, and Isabella Rodriguez's impossible recovery had convinced her that my techniques represented the future of cardiac surgery. "Elena, I'm not just offering you a position," she explained during our meeting in her corner office overlooking Lake Michigan. "I'm offering you the chance to build something that's never existed before. A cardiac surgery program designed around innovation rather than institutional politics." Northwestern Memorial had just completed construction of their new Cardiovascular Innovation Center, a state-of-the-art facility equipped with the most advanced surgical technology in the world. The center had been designed specifically to attract surgeons who were pushing the boundaries of what cardiac surgery could accomplish. "You would have complete autonomy over surgical approaches," Lisa continued. "No committee oversight, no protocol restrictions, no administrator telling you which techniques you can or can't use. The only requirement is that you document everything and be prepared to teach your methods to other surgeons." It was everything I had dreamed of during my years of suppression at Metropolitan General: the chance to practice medicine the way it should be practiced, with patient outcomes as the only measure of success. But I also knew that accepting Lisa's offer would make me a target for every traditional surgeon who felt threatened by innovation. Success at Northwestern would mean proving that conventional approaches were obsolete, and that would create enemies throughout the medical establishment. "When can I start?" I asked. The first challenge of establishing an innovative cardiac surgery program was assembling a team that could match my vision for what modern surgery could accomplish. I needed surgeons who were technically excellent but also willing to abandon everything they had learned about traditional approaches. I needed nurses who could adapt to constantly evolving procedures. Most importantly, I needed residents who could learn new techniques without being constrained by outdated textbook knowledge. Dr. James Rodriguez was my first recruit. After completing his residency at Metropolitan General, he had been offered positions at prestigious hospitals across the country, but he chose to follow me to Northwestern because he understood that learning revolutionary techniques was worth more than institutional prestige. "Dr. Vasquez, I've seen what you can accomplish with impossible cases," he told me as we toured the Innovation Center's facilities. "I want to learn surgery from someone who's writing the textbooks instead of just following them." Sarah Martinez joined our team as Director of Surgical Technology, bringing her expertise in biomedical engineering and her comprehensive understanding of the techniques we had developed together in secret. Her role would be to optimize our robotic systems, imaging technology, and surgical instruments to support approaches that had never been attempted before. But our most important recruit was Dr. Alexandra Petrov, a brilliant young surgeon who had just completed a fellowship in pediatric cardiology at Boston Children's Hospital. At 31 years old, Alexandra had already pioneered several innovative approaches to congenital heart defects, and her combination of technical skill and creative thinking made her the perfect partner for the work we were planning. "Elena, I've been following your research for 2 years," she told me during her interview. The Vasquez protocol could revolutionize not just adult cardiac surgery, but pediatric applications as well. I want to be part of building that future. Within 6 months, we had assembled a team of 12 surgeons, engineers, and researchers who shared a common commitment to proving that innovation could transform patient outcomes in ways the medical establishment had never imagined. Our reputation for accepting impossible cases began almost immediately after the Innovation Center opened. Patients who had been turned away by multiple surgeons, families who had been told that nothing more could be done, medical professionals who had exhausted every traditional option, they all began finding their way to our program. The first case that would define our approach came from Dr. Patricia Williams, a cardiothoracic surgeon at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. She called me personally about Marcus Thompson, a 4-year-old boy with a combination of congenital heart defects that made conventional surgery impossible. Elena, this child has hypoplastic left heart syndrome combined with pulmonary atresia and multiple ventricular septal defects, Dr. Williams explained during our video consultation. We've consulted with pediatric cardiac surgeons across the country, and everyone agrees that the defects are too complex for repair. The family is looking at palliative care options. I studied Marcus's imaging studies for 3 hours, analyzing the anatomy from every angle and considering approaches that had never been attempted for this combination of defects. What I saw was challenging, but not impossible, if we could combine my minimally invasive techniques with Alexandra's expertise in pediatric applications. Dr. Williams, I think we can save this child's life, I told her during our follow-up call. But the surgery would require techniques that haven't been tried before for this type of case. Are you willing to attempt it? We're willing to guarantee it. Marcus Thompson's surgery took place on a Tuesday morning in October, with a team of specialists observing via live video feed from pediatric cardiac centers across the country. The complexity of his defects required a completely new approach that combined robotic microsurgery, real-time 3D cardiac mapping, and tissue engineering techniques that we had developed specifically for this case. Working with Alexandra and our team of perfusionists, we spent 8 hours reconstructing Marcus's heart through incisions smaller than a dime. Using robotic instruments with precision measured in micrometers, we repaired septal defects, reconstructed pulmonary arteries, and created functional connections that traditional surgery could never have achieved. The breakthrough moment came when we activated Marcus's repaired heart for the first time. The monitors showed perfect circulation, normal pressure gradients, and cardiac function that exceeded typical ranges for a healthy 4-year-old. Elena, his oxygen saturation is 98%, Alexandra reported, her voice filled with amazement. His cardiac output is completely normal. This is anatomically and functionally a perfect repair. Marcus woke up from surgery talking to his parents and asking for his favorite toy truck. Within 48 hours, he was running around the pediatric ward with energy levels his parents had never seen before. Within a week, he was home playing with siblings who had never been able to keep up with him before. But the real significance of Marcus's case wasn't just his individual recovery. It was the proof that our techniques could be applied to any cardiac condition, regardless of complexity or previous assumptions about impossibility. While our pediatric successes were generating attention throughout children's hospitals, our adult trauma cases were revolutionizing emergency cardiac surgery in ways that traditional approaches had never imagined possible. The case that would eventually become the foundation for our trauma protocol came to us on a Saturday night in December, when a medical helicopter landed on Northwestern's roof carrying a patient that represented every emergency surgeon's worst nightmare. Detective Maria Santos had been shot 3 times during a robbery investigation, with bullets causing massive damage to her heart, lungs, and major vessels. The trauma team at the initial hospital had managed to stabilize her circulation temporarily, but their assessment was grim. The injuries were too extensive for repair, and she had maybe 6 hours to live. Dr. Vasquez, we know this is beyond conventional surgery, the trauma surgeon explained during our emergency consultation. But Detective Santos has 3 children and a husband who's also a police officer. If there's any chance your techniques could save her life, we're willing to transport her immediately. Looking at Maria's imaging studies, I could see damage that would have been impossible to repair using traditional approaches. But our minimally invasive techniques, combined with advanced perfusion technology, offered possibilities that conventional surgery couldn't match. Have her transported immediately, I told the trauma team. We'll be ready. Maria Santos's surgery began at 11:30 p.m. and continued through the night, with our team working in perfect coordination to repair damage that should have been fatal. Using techniques we had developed for complex trauma cases, we reconstructed her heart chambers, repaired arterial tears, and restored circulation without ever stopping her heart or compromising her brain function. The most challenging aspect was repairing bullet damage to her left ventricle, while maintaining cardiac output sufficient to keep her alive. Traditional surgery would have required cardiopulmonary bypass for hours, with significant risk of stroke or brain damage. Our approach allowed us to work on her heart while it continued beating, using robotic instruments guided by real-time imaging. At 7:45 a.m., we completed the final sutures and watched as Maria's vital signs stabilized at completely normal levels. Her heart function was perfect, her circulation was restored, and her recovery trajectory indicated that she would not only survive, but return to full duty as a police detective. "Elena, this is impossible," James observed as we reviewed Maria's postoperative imaging. 6 hours ago, she was dying from injuries that every textbook says are incompatible with survival. Now her cardiac function is completely normal. "It's only impossible if you limit yourself to traditional approaches," I replied. "Innovation means redefining what's possible." Maria returned to active duty as a police detective 4 months later, with no limitations on her physical activity and no signs of the trauma that had nearly killed her. Her case became the template for our emergency cardiac trauma protocol, which would eventually be adopted by trauma centers across the country. While our clinical successes were generating attention throughout the medical community, the research program we developed at Northwestern was creating a foundation for systematic transformation of cardiac surgery. Working with Sarah Martinez and a team of biomedical engineers, we were documenting not just that our techniques worked, but why they worked better than traditional approaches. Our research laboratory became a center for developing next-generation surgical technology that could support approaches most surgeons had never imagined. We designed new robotic instruments with precision capabilities that exceeded human limitations. We created imaging systems that could map cardiac anatomy in real time during surgery. We developed tissue engineering techniques that could repair damage conventional surgery couldn't address. Most importantly, we created comprehensive training protocols that could teach our techniques to surgeons at other institutions. Innovation without dissemination is just personal achievement. We were building a system that could transform cardiac surgery worldwide. "Elena, our outcome data is unprecedented," Sarah reported during one of our weekly research reviews. "Compared to traditional cardiac surgery, our approaches show 70% shorter recovery times, 85% fewer complications, and 95% higher patient satisfaction scores. We're not just incrementally better, we're fundamentally transforming what cardiac surgery can accomplish." Quote, "One of the most rewarding aspects of our program was training the next generation of cardiac surgeons to think beyond conventional limitations. Our residency program attracted the most innovative young surgeons in the country, doctors who wanted to learn techniques that were reshaping the future of medicine. Dr. Jennifer Kim joined our program after completing medical school at Johns Hopkins with the highest academic honors in her class. But what impressed me most about Jennifer wasn't her test scores. It was her willingness to question everything she had learned and embrace approaches that challenged traditional assumptions. Dr. Vasquez, medical school taught me how cardiac surgery has been performed for the past 50 years, she told me during one of our teaching sessions. But watching you work, I'm learning how cardiac surgery should be performed for the next 50 years. Training innovative surgeons required completely reimagining medical education. Instead of memorizing established procedures, our residents learned to analyze each case individually and design surgical approaches optimized for specific patient needs. Instead of following protocol manuals, they learned to create new protocols based on emerging technology and evolving understanding of cardiac physiology. Our residents were becoming surgical innovators rather than surgical technicians, and their success rates reflected the difference between creative problem-solving and procedural compliance. As word spread about our results, we began receiving consultation requests from cardiac surgeons around the world. Doctors who had been struggling with complex cases, medical centers that wanted to implement innovative approaches, research institutions that needed expertise in advanced surgical techniques. Everyone wanted to understand how we were achieving outcomes that traditional surgery couldn't match. Dr. Robert Chin, Chief of Cardiac Surgery at Mayo Clinic, visited our program for a week-long observation that would fundamentally change his approach to complex cases. "Elena, what you've built here isn't just a cardiac surgery program," he told me as we reviewed cases together. "It's a completely new model for how innovative medicine should be practiced." Within 18 months, we had established collaborative relationships with cardiac centers in 12 countries, training programs that were spreading our techniques throughout the medical community, and research partnerships that were accelerating the development of next-generation surgical technology. But our most important achievement wasn't the individual cases we had saved or the techniques we had developed. It was proving that innovation could thrive when given the freedom to challenge conventional assumptions. The call that would change everything came on a Thursday afternoon in February, 18 months after we had opened the Innovation Center. Dr. Michael Brennan, president of the American College of Surgeons, was personally inviting me to present our work at their annual conference, the most prestigious gathering of surgeons in the world. "Dr. Vasquez, your outcomes data has been reviewed by our scientific committee, and we want you to deliver the keynote presentation on the future of cardiac surgery," Dr. Brennan explained. "This would be the perfect platform to share your innovations with the entire surgical community." It was the opportunity I had been working toward for 5 years. The chance to prove to the medical establishment that innovation matters more than tradition, that patient outcomes matter more than institutional politics, and that the future of surgery belongs to doctors who refuse to accept that "this is how we've always done it" is good enough. But I also knew that presenting at the American College of Surgeons conference would mean facing an audience that included many of the doctors who had dismissed my work, suppressed my innovations, and tried to end my career, including Dr. Harrison Blake, who would be sitting in the front row, watching as I received recognition for everything he had tried to destroy. "Dr. Brennan, I would be honored to present our work," I replied. "When is the conference?" "October 15th in San Francisco." "Dr. Vasquez, I should mention that you're also being considered for our Surgeon of the Year award, based on your remarkable contributions to advancing cardiac surgery." As I hung up the phone, I realized that the vindication I had been working toward was finally within reach. In 8 months, I would be standing before the most respected surgeons in America, presenting innovations that would transform their understanding of what cardiac surgery could accomplish. And the doctors who had laughed at my techniques would be forced to acknowledge that excellence always finds a way to reveal itself, regardless of the obstacles placed in its path. The secret weapon phase of my career was complete. The public vindication phase was about to begin. Innovation had taught me that the most powerful breakthroughs happen not when institutions support change, but when passionate individuals refuse to accept limitations. Every case we saved, every technique we perfected, every surgeon we trained was proof that excellence doesn't require permission. It only requires courage. In 8 months, the entire medical establishment would learn what I had discovered through years of struggle, that the future belongs to those who dare to imagine better ways of healing, and that sometimes the greatest innovations come from the doctors who refuse to stay quiet when they know there's a better way. The conference stage was waiting, the award was within reach. And the doctors who had dismissed me were about to discover that underestimating innovation is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. The invitation to present at the American College of Surgeons annual conference created ripple effects throughout the medical community that I hadn't anticipated. Within days of the announcement, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from surgeons who wanted to understand what I had developed that warranted such prestigious recognition. But not all the attention was positive. Dr. Harrison Blake's reaction to my keynote invitation revealed the depth of institutional resistance to innovation that still existed within traditional medical establishments. "Dr. Vasquez's experimental approaches may show short-term success," Blake told Medical Tribune in an interview that was clearly designed to undermine my credibility before the conference. "But the surgical community should be cautious about embracing techniques that haven't been validated through traditional peer review processes. Patient safety must always take precedence over surgical innovation." What Blake didn't mention was that our techniques had now been successfully performed on over 400 patients with zero mortality and complication rates, 80% lower than traditional approaches. What he couldn't acknowledge was that his traditional peer review processes had consistently rejected innovations that were saving lives and transforming patient outcomes. Reading his comments in the medical journal, I realized that my success wasn't just validating innovative surgery, it was exposing fundamental flaws in how the medical establishment evaluated and adopted new techniques. The old guard was feeling threatened, and threatened institutions rarely respond with grace or objectivity. While I was building revolutionary surgical programs at Northwestern, traditional cardiac surgery was facing a crisis of confidence that had been brewing for years. Hospitals across the country were reporting increasing complication rates, longer recovery times, and patient satisfaction scores that painted a disturbing picture of an industry resistant to meaningful change. The crisis became undeniable when the Journal of American Medical Association published a comprehensive study comparing cardiac surgery outcomes across different institutions and approaches. The data revealed systematic problems with traditional methods that could no longer be ignored or explained away. Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia called me personally to discuss the implications of the study. Elena, the JAMA data shows that pediatric cardiac surgery has actually gotten worse over the past 5 years. Complication rates are up 15%, recovery times are 25% longer, and we're seeing increased mortality in cases that should be routine. What do you think is causing the deterioration? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Institutional resistance to innovation. Surgeons are still using techniques from the 1990s because that's what department heads learned during their residencies. Meanwhile, patients are suffering because we're prioritizing tradition over results. The pediatric data was particularly damning because it showed how institutional conservatism was directly harming the most vulnerable patients. Children with congenital heart defects were undergoing multiple surgeries when single procedures should have been sufficient. Recovery times that should have been measured in days were stretching into weeks. Most tragically, children were dying from complications that innovative techniques could have prevented. The most dramatic example of institutional failure came from my former workplace, where Dr. Blake's resistance to innovation was creating a cascade of problems that threatened the entire cardiac surgery program. Dr. James Rodriguez, who had maintained contact with colleagues still working at Metropolitan General, called me with disturbing reports about the department's deteriorating performance. Elena, they've had 3 major complications in the past month, all involving cases where your techniques could have prevented the problems. The details were heartbreaking. A 52-year-old teacher named Patricia Morgan had undergone what should have been routine valve replacement surgery. Instead of using minimally invasive approaches that would have required a 2-inch incision and 3-day recovery, Blake's team had performed traditional open-heart surgery that required breaking her ribs and resulted in a month-long hospitalization complicated by infections and breathing problems. Patricia spent 6 weeks in the hospital and will need months of rehabilitation, James reported. With your approach, she would have been home in 3 days with no complications. Even more tragic was the case of 67-year-old Robert Kim, a grandfather who needed emergency bypass surgery after a heart attack. The traditional approach used by Blake's team required stopping his heart for over 2 hours, resulting in mild brain damage that left him with permanent cognitive impairment. Elena, I watched them perform that surgery, and I kept thinking about how you would have approached it, James told me, his voice heavy with frustration. With your techniques, they could have completed the bypass without stopping his heart at all. Mr. Kim would have made a complete recovery, instead of spending the rest of his life in assisted living. Perhaps the most telling indicator of institutional dysfunction was the exodus of experienced nurses from traditional cardiac surgery programs. Nurses who had spent decades in operating rooms were requesting transfers to other departments, or leaving medicine entirely, rather than continue participating in outdated surgical approaches. Margaret Thompson, who had been the lead cardiac surgery nurse at Metropolitan General for 15 years, contacted me personally about the situation. Dr. Vasquez, I can't watch patients suffer needlessly anymore. I know there are better ways to perform these surgeries because I worked with you for 3 years. Watching surgeons use techniques that cause unnecessary trauma feels like participating in malpractice. Margaret's frustration reflected a broader pattern occurring throughout the medical community. Nurses, who spend more time with patients than any other medical professionals, were witnessing firsthand the difference between innovative and traditional approaches. They saw which patients recovered quickly and which struggled with preventable complications. They understood which techniques minimized pain and which caused unnecessary suffering. The nurses are starting to request specific surgeons, Margaret explained. They don't want to work with doctors who refuse to adopt better techniques. It's creating division within departments and making it impossible to maintain good surgical teams. The nursing perspective was particularly important because these professionals had no financial incentive to prefer one surgical approach over another. Their only motivation was providing the best possible patient care, which meant they naturally gravitated toward techniques that produced superior outcomes. The crisis in traditional cardiac surgery became financially unsustainable when insurance companies began analyzing outcome data and refusing to pay premium rates for substandard results. The numbers told a story that hospital administrators could no longer ignore. Innovative surgical approaches were not only producing better patient outcomes, but doing so at significantly lower costs. Dr. Michael Chen, a health economics researcher at Harvard Business School, published a comprehensive analysis that quantified the financial impact of surgical innovation. His data showed that minimally invasive cardiac surgery reduced total treatment costs by an average of 40%, while improving patient satisfaction scores by 60%. Traditional cardiac surgery is becoming economically unsustainable, Dr. Chen explained during a healthcare conference that was widely reported in medical journals. Hospitals that continue using outdated techniques are charging premium prices for inferior results. Insurance companies are starting to demand better value for their payments. The financial pressure created a situation where hospital administrators were forced to choose between supporting surgeons who protected traditional approaches and embracing innovations that improved both patient outcomes and institutional profitability. For doctors like Blake, who had built their careers on resistance to change, this economic reality represented an existential threat to their professional authority. Perhaps the most significant challenge to traditional cardiac surgery came from medical residents, who were demanding training in innovative techniques rather than outdated approaches. Young surgeons who had spent years studying the latest medical research understood that conventional methods were being rapidly superseded by better alternatives. Dr. Jennifer Kim, who had completed rotations at both traditional programs and our Innovation Center, became a vocal advocate for comprehensive reform in surgical education. Medical schools are teaching us about cutting-edge surgical techniques, but residency programs are still training us to perform surgery the way it was done 30 years ago, she wrote in a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine that was endorsed by over 200 resident physicians. We're being trained to use approaches that we know are inferior to available alternatives. This isn't just educational malpractice. It's preparation for a lifetime of providing substandard patient care. The resident rebellion created pressure on department heads who were struggling to attract the best young surgeons to their programs. Talented residents were increasingly choosing innovative programs over prestigious traditional institutions, recognizing that superior training mattered more than institutional reputation. The most powerful force driving change in cardiac surgery was the growing patient advocacy movement, led by families who had experienced both traditional and innovative approaches and understood the dramatic differences in outcomes. Sarah Chen, whose husband David had been saved by my unauthorized surgery 3 years earlier, became a prominent spokesperson for surgical innovation. Her advocacy organization, Patients Deserve Better, began documenting cases where traditional surgery had failed and innovative approaches had succeeded. My husband is alive today because Dr. Vasquez was willing to use the best available techniques instead of following outdated protocols, Sarah testified at a congressional hearing on healthcare innovation. How many other families are losing loved ones because hospitals prioritize tradition over results? The patient advocacy movement was particularly effective because their arguments were based on lived experience rather than theoretical concerns. Families who had watched loved ones suffer through unnecessary complications, extended recoveries, and preventable failures provided compelling testimony that institutional conservatism was causing real harm to real people. The confluence of patient advocacy, insurance company pressure, and medical professional frustration created a media spotlight on cardiac surgery that hospital administrators could no longer ignore. Major news outlets began investigating why some institutions were achieving dramatically better results than others, and their reports revealed uncomfortable truths about institutional resistance to innovation. 60 Minutes produced a segment comparing patient outcomes at traditional versus innovative cardiac surgery programs, featuring interviews with patients who had experienced both approaches. The contrast was stark. Patients treated with innovative techniques were returning to normal activities within weeks, while those receiving traditional care struggled with months of recovery and permanent limitations. The most powerful moment in the broadcast came when Patricia Morgan, the teacher who had undergone traditional valve replacement at Metropolitan General, met Isabella Rodriguez, the trauma patient whose life I had saved with innovative techniques. Isabella's surgery was far more complex than mine, Patricia observed, but she recovered in days while I struggled for months. How is that possible if both hospitals are providing the same quality of care? The media attention created public pressure for transparency in surgical outcomes and accountability for institutions that continued using inferior techniques when better alternatives were available. As the October conference date approached, it became clear that my keynote presentation would be more than an academic discussion of surgical techniques. It would be a defining moment in the battle between institutional conservatism and medical innovation. Dr. Blake's campaign to discredit my work had intensified, with supporters arguing that my techniques were unproven experimental procedures that posed unnecessary risks to patients. Meanwhile, the mounting evidence of traditional surgery's failures was making their position increasingly untenable. The American College of Surgeons found themselves hosting a conference that would essentially determine the future direction of cardiac surgery. Would the medical establishment embrace innovation and commit to better patient outcomes? Or would they retreat into institutional defensiveness and continue protecting approaches that were demonstrably inferior? Dr. Michael Brennan, the conference organizer, called me personally to discuss the significance of my presentation. Elena, there will be over 3,000 surgeons in attendance, including department heads from every major cardiac center in the country. This isn't just a presentation. It's an opportunity to transform how cardiac surgery is practiced worldwide. I understand the responsibility, I replied, but I also understand that some people in that audience would prefer to discredit innovation rather than admit that their approaches need fundamental improvement. That's exactly why this presentation is so important. The medical community needs to see proof that innovation can deliver better results than tradition. Your outcomes data provides that proof. As I prepared for the conference presentation that would define my career and potentially transform cardiac surgery, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I had been a department head fighting institutional resistance to save individual patients. Now I was preparing to present evidence that could save thousands of patients by changing how surgery was performed worldwide. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Success would validate everything I had worked for and provide a platform for spreading innovative techniques throughout the medical community. Failure would be seized upon by traditionalists as proof that innovation was dangerous and that institutional conservatism was justified. But I also knew that the evidence was overwhelming. Our techniques had saved hundreds of lives, trained dozens of surgeons, and created a model for surgical excellence that was being replicated at medical centers around the world. The question wasn't whether our innovations worked. The question was whether the medical establishment was ready to admit that traditional approaches were no longer adequate for modern patient care. In 6 weeks, I would have my answer. Standing in the Innovation Center, surrounded by the most advanced surgical technology in the world, and colleagues who shared my commitment to excellence, I felt the confidence that comes from knowing that truth eventually prevails over politics. The old guard could resist change, but they couldn't argue with results, and our results spoke louder than any institutional authority or traditional credential. The conference stage was waiting, the medical community was watching, and the future of cardiac surgery was about to be decided by evidence, rather than politics. For the first time in my career, that felt like a fair fight. They thought they could protect outdated approaches by discrediting innovation, but every day brought new evidence that tradition was failing, while excellence was thriving. The cracks in their system were becoming chasms, and no amount of institutional authority could bridge the gap between their results and ours. In 6 weeks, the entire medical establishment would learn what I had discovered through years of struggle. That innovation doesn't ask for permission to transform the world. It simply demonstrates better ways of healing and lets the evidence speak for itself. The stage was set for the most important presentation of my career, and for the first time, I would be speaking from a position of strength rather than defending against institutional attacks. The tables were about to turn completely. 6 weeks before the American College of Surgeons annual conference, I sat in my office at Northwestern Memorial with a single sheet of paper in front of me, the official program listing that showed my keynote presentation, scheduled for 2 p.m. on Friday, October 15th. The title read, Revolutionary Approaches to Cardiac Surgery, Evidence-Based Innovation for Superior Patient Outcomes. 45 minutes. That's how long I would have to present evidence that could transform how cardiac surgery was practiced worldwide. 45 minutes to prove that innovation mattered more than tradition, that patient outcomes trumped institutional politics, and that the future of medicine belonged to surgeons who dared to challenge conventional wisdom. But I also knew that this presentation would be the most hostile audience I had ever faced. The conference would include every surgeon who had dismissed my work, every department head who had resisted innovation, and every medical administrator who preferred predictable mediocrity to groundbreaking excellence, including Dr. Harrison Blake, who would undoubtedly be sitting in the front row, waiting for any opportunity to discredit everything I had accomplished. This wasn't just a medical presentation, it was intellectual warfare, and I intended to win decisively. The first step in preparing for the conference was assembling an irrefutable collection of evidence that demonstrated the superiority of innovative surgical approaches. Working with Sarah Martinez and our research team, I spent 3 weeks creating the most comprehensive analysis of cardiac surgery outcomes ever compiled. Our database included detailed information on 847 patients who had undergone various cardiac procedures using our innovative techniques. Every case was documented with preoperative imaging, surgical video recordings, post-operative recovery data, and long-term follow-up results. More importantly, we had comparison data showing what traditional approaches would have achieved for the same patients. The numbers were staggering. Our techniques showed 72% reduction in surgical complications, 68% shorter recovery times 81% improvement in long-term cardiac function, 94% patient satisfaction rating compared to 67% for traditional surgery, 0 mortality in cases where traditional surgery carried 15 to 20% death rates. But raw statistics, no matter how impressive, wouldn't be enough to convince skeptical surgeons. I needed to present individual cases that demonstrated the human impact of surgical innovation, stories that would make it impossible for anyone to argue that tradition was adequate when excellence was available. The most powerful ammunition for my presentation came from 3 specific cases that perfectly illustrated why innovative surgery represented the future of cardiac medicine. Each case involved a patient who had been failed by traditional approaches and saved by techniques that challenged conventional wisdom. The first case was Timothy Morrison, a 72-year-old retired firefighter who had been told by 4 different cardiac surgeons that his complex aortic aneurysm was inoperable. Traditional surgery would require stopping his heart for over 3 hours, with a 40% chance of death and near certain brain damage if he survived. Using our minimally invasive approach, we had repaired Timothy's aneurysm through a 2-inch incision, while his heart continued beating normally. The surgery took 90 minutes, and Timothy was home within 3 days, with complete restoration of normal cardiac function. Dr. Vasquez didn't just save my life. Timothy had written in a letter that I planned to read during my presentation. She gave me back my future. I'm coaching Little League Baseball again, hiking with my grandchildren, and living without the constant fear that my heart might stop at any moment. The second case was Maria Gonzalez, a 34-year-old mother of twins who had developed postpartum cardiomyopathy, a condition that had left her heart functioning at only 25% of normal capacity. Traditional treatment offered medications that might slow the deterioration, but no possibility of restoration. Our innovative approach had used stem cell therapy combined with precision surgery to completely regenerate Maria's damaged heart muscle. 6 months after treatment, her cardiac function had returned to 95% of normal, and she was able to care for her children without limitations. I went from planning my funeral to planning my children's futures, Maria had told a medical journalist. Dr. Vasquez didn't just treat my condition, she gave me back my life as a mother. The third case was the most dramatic. David Park, a 16-year-old high school athlete who had suffered massive cardiac trauma in a car accident. The damage was so extensive that 3 emergency rooms had declared him unsavable before he was transported to our center. Using techniques that had never been attempted for trauma of this magnitude, We had spent 12 hours rebuilding David's heart while maintaining his circulation through advanced perfusion technology. The surgery required innovations that we developed in real time, adapting our approaches to address injuries that textbooks said were incompatible with survival. David had not only survived but returned to competitive athletics, with cardiac function superior to his pre-accident baseline. His case had redefined what was possible in trauma surgery and demonstrated that innovation could overcome obstacles that traditional medicine considered insurmountable. Beyond case studies and outcome data, I planned to use the conference presentation to demonstrate the advanced technology that made our surgical innovations possible. Working with our biomedical engineering team, we created a portable simulation system that could show conference attendees exactly how our techniques differed from traditional approaches. The centerpiece was a high-resolution 3D cardiac model that could simulate any type of heart surgery in real time. Conference attendees would be able to watch side-by-side comparisons of traditional versus innovative surgical approaches, seeing precisely why our methods achieved superior results. "Elena, this demonstration system is going to blow their minds," Sarah Martinez observed as we tested the equipment. "They'll be able to see millimeter by millimeter how your techniques minimize tissue trauma, reduce surgical time, and optimize healing." Quote, "The technology demonstration would serve two purposes. It would provide concrete visual evidence of our surgical superiority, and it would prove that our innovations weren't just experimental procedures, but systematic improvements based on advanced medical technology." One of the most important aspects of my conference presentation would be unveiling our comprehensive training protocol that could teach innovative surgical techniques to cardiac surgeons worldwide. Rather than keeping our methods proprietary, we had developed educational programs that could transform surgical practice at any institution willing to embrace change. Our training protocol included virtual reality simulation systems that allowed surgeons to practice innovative techniques without patient risk, comprehensive video libraries documenting every aspect of advanced cardiac procedures, mentorship programs that paired innovative surgeons with traditional practitioners seeking to upgrade their skills, outcome tracking systems that demonstrated improvement in surgical results as surgeons adopted new techniques. "We're not just proving that better surgery is possible," I explained to our training team. "We're providing a roadmap that any surgeon can follow to achieve superior patient outcomes." The training protocol would address the primary objection to surgical innovation, the concern that new techniques were too complex or risky for widespread adoption. By demonstrating that our methods could be taught systematically and implemented safely, we would remove the last excuse for continuing with inferior traditional approaches. Perhaps the most compelling argument for surgical innovation was the economic data showing that our techniques were not only medically superior but financially advantageous for hospitals, insurance companies, and patients. Working with health economics researchers, we had compiled comprehensive cost-benefit analyses that proved innovative surgery was good business as well as good medicine. Traditional cardiac surgery at Metropolitan General averaged $127,000 per procedure when all costs were included: surgical fees, hospital stay, complications, rehabilitation, and long-term care. Our innovative approaches averaged $78,000 per procedure, with significantly better outcomes and patient satisfaction. "Elena, the economic argument is going to be impossible for hospital administrators to ignore," observed Dr. Lisa Chen during one of our preparation meetings. "You're showing that innovation doesn't just save lives, it saves money while improving every measurable outcome." The economic data would be particularly powerful because it addressed concerns that innovative surgery was expensive experimental medicine that only wealthy patients could afford. Instead, we could prove that our techniques made excellent cardiac care more accessible by reducing costs while improving results. The conference presentation would conclude with our vision for transforming cardiac surgery worldwide through systematic dissemination of innovative techniques. We had already established partnerships with medical centers in 23 countries, training programs that were producing innovative surgeons on every continent, and research collaborations that were accelerating the development of next-generation surgical technology. Our global impact plan included mobile surgical teams that could bring innovative techniques to underserved regions, telemedicine programs that connected rural hospitals with expert surgical guidance, medical mission initiatives that provided advanced cardiac care in developing countries, international fellowship programs that train surgeons from emerging economies. "We're not just changing how surgery is performed in America," I plan to tell the conference audience. We're creating a model that can bring world-class cardiac care to every patient who needs it, regardless of geography or economic circumstances. The global vision would demonstrate that surgical innovation wasn't about personal achievement or institutional prestige. It was about fulfilling medicine's fundamental obligation to heal patients and save lives. While the bulk of my presentation would focus on positive evidence for surgical innovation, I also prepared to address the inevitable attacks from traditionalists who would attempt to discredit our work. I knew that Dr. Blake and his supporters would raise concerns about patient safety, regulatory approval, and the risks of adopting unproven techniques. My strategy was to address these objections directly with overwhelming evidence rather than defensive arguments. Every concern they raised had been anticipated and answered, with comprehensive data that proved innovative surgery was safer, more effective, and more reliable than traditional approaches. When they argued that our techniques were unproven, I would present outcome data from 847 successful procedures. When they claimed that innovation was risky, I would show complication rates 72% lower than traditional surgery. When they suggested that new techniques were too complex for widespread adoption, I would demonstrate training programs that had already successfully taught our methods to surgeons around the world. "Elena, you need to be prepared for them to get personal," warned Dr. Alexandra Petrov during one of our strategy sessions. "When they can't attack your data, they'll attack your credibility, your motives, and your right to challenge established medical practice." "Let them," I replied. "Personal attacks are what people resort to when they can't argue with facts. If they want to make this about personalities instead of patient outcomes, they'll only prove that they care more about protecting their egos than improving medical care." Understanding that the conference presentation would extend far beyond the surgical community, we developed a comprehensive media strategy to ensure that our message reached patients, families, and healthcare advocates who could drive demand for innovative surgical approaches. We prepared press releases highlighting our most dramatic patient success stories, arranged interviews with leading medical journalists, and created social media campaigns that would allow patients to share their experiences with innovative versus traditional cardiac surgery. "The medical establishment might resist change," observed Jennifer Kim, who was coordinating our media outreach. "But patients and families won't accept inferior care once they understand that better options are available." The media strategy would create public pressure for hospitals to adopt innovative techniques and make it politically impossible for administrators to continue supporting surgeons who refuse to embrace superior methods. As the conference date approached, I reflected on the personal journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I had been fighting to save individual patients despite institutional resistance. Now I was preparing to present evidence that could save thousands of patients by transforming how cardiac surgery was practiced worldwide. The stakes were enormous, but so was the opportunity. Success would validate everything I had worked for and provide a platform for spreading innovative techniques throughout the medical community. More importantly, it would prove that excellence could triumph over politics, that merit mattered more than tradition, and that the future belonged to those who dared to imagine better ways of healing. But I also knew that failure would be seized upon by traditionalists as proof that innovation was dangerous and that institutional conservatism was justified. One poorly received presentation could set back surgical progress by decades and condemn thousands of patients to unnecessary suffering. Standing in my office, looking out at the Chicago skyline, where I had once cleaned floors as a janitor and now directed revolutionary surgical programs, I felt the weight of responsibility that comes with the power to change the world. In 4 weeks, I would be standing on the most important stage of my medical career, presenting evidence that could transform how cardiac surgery was practiced worldwide. The medical establishment would be watching, the media would be listening, and the future of surgical innovation would be decided by how effectively I could prove that excellence always finds a way to reveal itself. I had spent 5 years preparing for this moment. I had assembled irrefutable evidence, developed revolutionary techniques, and trained a new generation of innovative surgeons. I had saved hundreds of lives and proved that better medicine was possible when artificial constraints were removed. Now it was time to convince the world. Preparation had taught me that the most powerful presentations aren't about persuasion. They're about demonstration. I wouldn't be asking the medical establishment to trust my theories or believe my promises. I would be showing them proof that innovation could deliver results traditional surgery could never achieve. In 4 weeks, every surgeon in that audience would be forced to choose between protecting their comfortable traditions and embracing evidence that could transform patient care. I knew which choice conscience demanded, and I was ready to make that choice impossible to avoid. The stage was set for the most important medical presentation of my generation. The evidence was overwhelming. And for the first time in my career, I would be speaking from a position of absolute strength. 2 weeks before the American College of Surgeons conference, an event occurred that would fundamentally change the dynamics of my upcoming presentation. It began with a phone call at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, the kind of call that every surgeon dreads and every innovator secretly hopes for. Dr. Vasquez, this is Dr. Robert Chang from UCLA Medical Center. The voice on the other end was strained with exhaustion and desperation. We have a situation here that's beyond anything our team has encountered. We need your expertise immediately. I was already reaching for my clothes as Dr. Chang explained the case. A commercial airliner had experienced catastrophic engine failure during takeoff from Los Angeles International Airport, resulting in an emergency landing that had saved most lives but left 3 passengers with cardiac injuries so severe that traditional surgery offered no hope of survival. Dr. Vasquez, we've consulted with cardiac surgeons across the country, and everyone agrees that these injuries are incompatible with life. But we've been following your work, and we think your techniques might be the only chance these patients have. The situation was unprecedented. 3 separate patients, each with different types of massive cardiac trauma, all requiring immediate surgery that had never been attempted before. More importantly, the entire medical community would be watching to see whether innovative techniques could save lives that traditional surgery had written off as hopeless. Within 6 hours, I was on a plane to Los Angeles with Alexandra Petrov and Sarah Martinez, carrying portable surgical equipment that could support techniques UCLA had never seen before. But what made this case truly extraordinary was the unprecedented collaboration it sparked within the medical community. Word had spread throughout cardiac surgery networks that 3 impossible cases were being attempted using revolutionary techniques. Surgeons from around the world requested permission to observe via live video feed, creating an impromptu medical summit that would demonstrate innovative surgery to the largest audience of cardiac specialists ever assembled. Elena, we have over 500 surgeons from 23 countries logged into the observation network, Sarah reported as we prepared for the first surgery. This isn't just emergency medicine, it's the most watched cardiac surgery demonstration in history. Among the observers was Dr. Harrison Blake, who had made a point of publicly stating that he was monitoring the procedures to document any evidence of reckless experimentation that endangered patient lives. His presence in the virtual audience added an element of professional risk that went far beyond the medical challenges we faced. If these surgeries succeeded, they would validate everything I had argued about innovative techniques. If they failed, Blake would have the ammunition he needed to destroy my credibility before the upcoming conference. Patient 1 was Amanda Rodriguez, a 42-year-old software engineer whose chest had been crushed during the emergency landing, causing massive damage to her left ventricle, pulmonary arteries, and aortic root. Traditional surgery would require replacing her entire heart, a procedure that had never been successfully performed following trauma of this magnitude. Instead, I proposed using our most advanced regenerative techniques to rebuild her heart tissue while maintaining circulation through extracorporeal support systems. The surgery would require precision measured in micrometers and coordination between technologies that had never been combined before. Ladies and gentlemen, I addressed the global audience of observing surgeons as we began the procedure. What you're about to witness represents the future of trauma surgery. We're not just repairing damage. We're regenerating functional cardiac tissue that will be stronger than the original anatomy. For 8 hours, our team worked with robotic instruments guided by real-time imaging that showed cellular-level detail of heart tissue regeneration. Using stem cell therapy combined with precision surgery, we rebuilt Amanda's heart chambers while her circulation was maintained through the most advanced perfusion technology available. The breakthrough moment came when we activated Amanda's reconstructed heart for the first time. The monitors showed not just normal cardiac function, but performance that exceeded her pre-trauma baseline. Dr. Vasquez, reported Dr. Chang, his voice filled with amazement. Her cardiac output is 120% of normal. You didn't just save her life, you gave her a better heart than she had before the accident. The global audience of surgeons watched in stunned silence as Amanda's vital signs stabilized at levels that indicated complete recovery from injuries that every textbook defined as fatal. Patient 2 was 67-year-old Thomas Chen, whose cardiac trauma had resulted in multiple chamber ruptures combined with massive bleeding that had left him on the verge of death for over 6 hours. Traditional surgery would require stopping his heart while attempting repairs that had less than 5% chance of success. Our approach involved a technique I had been developing in secret: continuous circulation surgery that allowed us to repair his heart while it continued beating. The procedure required inserting micro-robotic instruments through vessels smaller than pencil leads, guided by 3D imaging that updated in real time. The key to this technique, I explained to the observing surgeons, is understanding that the heart is designed to heal itself if we can create the right conditions. Instead of stopping circulation and traumatizing surrounding tissue, we're supporting natural healing while making precise repairs. The surgery took 6 hours and required innovations that we developed in real time to address complications that had never been encountered before. At one point, we had to design new surgical instruments using 3D printing technology to reach areas of Thomas's heart that traditional tools couldn't access. When Thomas's heart function was restored to normal levels, the global audience erupted in virtual applause that created technical difficulties for the observation network. Surgeons from around the world were witnessing techniques that challenged every assumption they had made about the limitations of cardiac surgery. Patient 3 was the most challenging case of my career. 28-year-old Maria Santos, a mother of twin toddlers whose cardiac trauma had resulted in complete destruction of her heart's electrical system, combined with massive structural damage. She had been clinically dead for 12 minutes before emergency responders restored minimal circulation. Traditional medicine offered no treatment for her condition. Her heart could not generate electrical impulses, and the structural damage made mechanical pumping impossible. Every cardiac surgeon who reviewed her case agreed that she was beyond medical intervention. But I saw possibilities that traditional approaches had never considered. Using experimental bioelectrical therapy combined with tissue regeneration, we could potentially rebuild both the structural and electrical systems of her heart simultaneously. What we're attempting has never been done before, I told the global audience as we prepared for the most complex cardiac surgery ever attempted. We're essentially creating a new heart using her existing tissue as the foundation. The procedure required 16 hours of continuous surgery, with our team working in shifts to maintain the precision necessary for cellular-level reconstruction. We used stem cell therapy to regenerate damaged tissue, bioelectrical stimulation to restore normal heart rhythm, and robotic microsurgery to rebuild connections between chambers. The moment that would be replayed in medical schools for decades came when we activated Maria's reconstructed heart for the first time. The monitor showed not just normal function, but electrical patterns more regular than most healthy hearts. "This is impossible," whispered Dr. Chang, staring at readouts that showed Maria's heart functioning at optimal levels. 12 hours ago, she was clinically dead. Now her cardiac function is perfect. Maria woke up the next morning asking about her children, with no memory of the trauma that had nearly killed her and no limitation on her ability to resume normal life as a mother. The successful completion of 3 impossible surgeries using innovative techniques created a response within the medical community that exceeded anything I had anticipated. Surgeons who had dismissed my work as experimental were forced to acknowledge that our techniques had achieved results that traditional surgery could never have delivered. Dr. Patricia Williams from Children's Hospital of Philadelphia called me personally to discuss the implications of what we had accomplished. "Elena, what happened in Los Angeles has changed everything. You didn't just save 3 lives, you proved that cardiac surgery has been limited by our imagination rather than medical reality." Medical journals around the world requested detailed documentation of our techniques. Research institutions offered funding for studies that could validate our approaches for widespread adoption. Most importantly, hospitals began demanding training programs that could bring innovative surgical capabilities to their own institutions. But the most significant response came from an unexpected source. The American College of Surgeons announced that they were restructuring the upcoming conference to focus entirely on the future of cardiac surgery, with my presentation moved to the opening keynote position before an audience that would now include the most prominent surgeons from around the world. Dr. Harrison Blake's reaction to the Los Angeles surgeries revealed the depth of institutional resistance that still existed within traditional medical establishments. Rather than acknowledging the obvious success of innovative techniques, he launched a campaign to discredit the procedures as, quote, dangerous experimentation that succeeded through luck rather than science. Dr. Vasquez's techniques may have appeared successful in these specific cases, Blake told Medical Weekly in an interview designed to undermine confidence in surgical innovation. But the medical community should be concerned about adopting unproven approaches based on isolated incidents rather than systematic peer review. Blake's comments revealed a fundamental disconnect between traditional medical thinking and the reality of modern surgical innovation. He was arguing that saving 3 lives that conventional surgery had written off as hopeless was somehow evidence against adopting superior techniques. More troubling was his announcement that he would be presenting a quote-unquote counter-analysis at the conference, arguing that innovative surgery represented an unacceptable risk to patient safety, and that the medical community should recommit to traditional approaches that had been, quote, proven safe through decades of experience. The Los Angeles surgeries had been observed by medical journalists who understood that they were witnessing history being made. Within days, major news outlets were featuring stories about revolutionary cardiac surgery that had saved impossible cases through techniques that challenged everything the public thought they knew about medical limitations. The most powerful coverage came from Good Morning America, which featured live interviews with all 3 patients who had been saved by innovative surgery. Watching Amanda Rodriguez describe her complete recovery, Thomas Chen demonstrate his return to normal activities, and Maria Santos play with her twin children provided compelling evidence that surgical innovation was about real people rather than abstract medical theories. Dr. Vasquez didn't just give us back our lives, Maria told the national television audience. She proved that medicine doesn't have to accept limitations when better solutions are possible. The media coverage created public awareness of surgical innovation that put pressure on hospitals and insurance companies to demand access to techniques that could deliver superior patient outcomes. Families began asking specific questions about whether their loved ones were receiving innovative care or traditional approaches. Perhaps the most significant development following the Los Angeles surgeries was the emergence of anonymous testimonials from surgeons who had been secretly implementing innovative techniques at their own institutions. These doctors had been afraid to publicly advocate for surgical innovation, but the success of high-profile cases gave them courage to share their own experiences. A cardiac surgeon from Johns Hopkins submitted detailed case studies showing that minimally invasive techniques had reduced complication rates by 60% at their institution. A pediatric heart specialist from Boston Children's Hospital documented cases where innovative approaches had saved children that traditional surgery couldn't help. An emergency surgeon from Trauma Center in Miami provided evidence that advanced techniques had transformed survival rates for cardiac trauma cases. Elena, you've given voice to surgeons who have been practicing innovation in secret for years, observed Driveleys. Lisa Chen as we reviewed the anonymous submissions. These doctors have been achieving superior results but felt unable to share their success because of institutional pressure to conform to traditional approaches. The anonymous evidence created a groundswell of support for surgical innovation that extended far beyond our program at Northwestern. It demonstrated that progressive surgeons throughout the medical community were ready to embrace techniques that could improve patient outcomes if they were given institutional support and professional recognition. The success of the Los Angeles surgeries fundamentally changed the dynamics of the upcoming American College of Surgeons conference. What had been planned as a traditional medical gathering was transformed into a defining moment for the future of cardiac surgery. Conference organizers announced that attendance had increased by 400%, with surgeons from 47 countries requesting permission to observe presentations on surgical innovation. Medical technology companies demanded exhibition space to demonstrate equipment that could support advanced techniques. Research institutions scheduled symposiums to discuss implementation of innovative approaches at their facilities. Most significantly, the conference program was restructured to focus on evidence-based innovation in cardiac surgery, with sessions dedicated to training surgeons in techniques that had been proven superior to traditional approaches. Elena, this isn't just a medical conference anymore, Dr. Michael Brennan explained during a planning call. This has become the most important gathering of cardiac surgeons in history, the moment when our profession decides whether to embrace the future or retreat into the past. Standing in my office 2 weeks before the conference, I reflected on how dramatically the landscape had changed since I first began fighting institutional resistance to surgical innovation. 5 years earlier, I had been struggling to save individual patients despite administrative obstacles. Now I was preparing to address the largest gathering of cardiac surgeons ever assembled, with evidence that could transform how medicine was practiced worldwide. The anonymous testimonials, global media coverage, and unprecedented professional interest had created momentum that made the conference presentation feel less like a defense of innovation and more like a celebration of what surgical excellence could accomplish when artificial constraints were removed. But I also understood that success brought new responsibilities. The medical community was looking to our program for leadership in transforming cardiac surgery, and patients around the world were counting on us to ensure that innovative techniques became available at every institution, rather than remaining limited to specialized centers. The stage was set for the most important medical presentation of my career, but now I would be speaking to an audience that was eager to learn rather than defensive about change. The evidence was overwhelming, the momentum was unstoppable, and the future of cardiac surgery was finally aligned with the interests of patients rather than institutional politics. In 2 weeks, I would prove that excellence always finds a way to reveal itself, even when faced with the most entrenched resistance to change. The Los Angeles surgeries had accomplished something I never could have achieved through arguments or presentations alone. They had demonstrated beyond doubt that innovation could save lives. Traditional surgery had given up for lost. Sometimes the most powerful revolution begins not with confrontation, but with anonymous proof that better ways are possible. In 2 weeks, I would stand before the medical establishment, not as someone asking for permission to innovate, but as someone who had already proven that the future of surgery was too important to be limited by the fears of the past. The revelation was complete, the evidence was undeniable, and the transformation of cardiac surgery was about to begin. The morning before the American College of Surgeons conference officially began, I found myself in an unexpected meeting that would define the next phase of my career. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, president of the World Health Organization's Surgical Innovation Council, had requested a private breakfast meeting at the St. Francis Hotel in San Francisco to discuss what she termed the future of global cardiac surgery. Dr. Vasquez, she began as we sat overlooking Union Square. The Los Angeles surgeries have created a situation that extends far beyond American medicine. We have calls from health ministers in 34 countries asking how they can implement your techniques in their national healthcare systems. The scope of international interest was staggering. The WHO had compiled requests for surgical innovation training from medical institutions on every continent, representing over 2 billion people who could potentially benefit from access to advanced cardiac care. Elena, we're not just talking about improving surgery in developed countries, Dr. Morrison continued. Your techniques could bring world-class cardiac care to regions where traditional surgery has been impossible due to resource limitations and infrastructure constraints. She showed me a comprehensive analysis that demonstrated how minimally invasive surgical techniques could transform healthcare in developing nations. Our approaches required less expensive equipment, shorter hospital stays, and fewer specialized personnel than traditional surgery, making advanced cardiac care accessible in regions where conventional methods had been economically unfeasible. We want to propose a global initiative, Dr. Morrison explained, the International Cardiac Innovation Program, with you as the founding director. This would involve training surgical teams worldwide, establishing innovation centers on every continent, and creating technology transfer programs that could save millions of lives over the next decade. The offer was both thrilling and overwhelming. Success at the upcoming conference would mean more than vindication of my techniques. It would create a platform for transforming global healthcare in ways I had never imagined possible. The morning meeting continued with the arrival of Dr. James Patterson, CEO of Advanced Medical Technologies, and Dr. Susan Chen, Director of Surgical Innovation at the National Institutes of Health. Their presence indicated that the conference had attracted attention from the highest levels of medical leadership and technology development. Elena, the Los Angeles surgeries have accelerated development timelines for surgical technology by at least 5 years, Dr. Patterson explained. Companies around the world are racing to create equipment that can support your techniques. We're looking at a complete transformation of the medical device industry. The economic implications were staggering. Advanced Medical Technologies had committed $500 million to developing robotic systems, imaging technology, and surgical instruments specifically designed for innovative cardiac procedures. Similar investments were being made by companies in Europe, Asia, and emerging markets, creating a global ecosystem focused on supporting surgical excellence. Dr. Vasquez, we're not just talking about incremental improvements to existing technology, Dr. Chen added. We're discussing fundamental breakthroughs that could make your techniques the standard of care worldwide within 3 years. The NIH had allocated $200 million for research into surgical innovation, with plans to establish training centers at major medical schools and fund studies that would validate advanced techniques for every type of cardiac condition. The federal investment represented unprecedented support for transforming how surgery was taught, practiced, and evaluated. As we concluded our breakfast meeting, Dr. Morrison shared intelligence about the organized resistance that would be attempting to undermine my conference presentation. Dr. Harrison Blake had assembled a coalition of traditional surgeons who planned to challenge every aspect of innovative cardiac surgery through coordinated questioning and public statements. Elena, they're calling themselves the Committee for Surgical Safety, Dr. Morrison explained. Blake has convinced about 30 department heads to sign a statement questioning whether your techniques have been adequately tested for widespread adoption. The opposition's strategy was sophisticated and potentially damaging. They planned to argue that the Los Angeles surgeries were isolated successes that didn't justify abandoning traditional approaches that had been proven safe through decades of experience. They would emphasize theoretical risks of innovation while downplaying the documented failures of conventional surgery. They're also planning to question your credentials and suggest that rapid adoption of new techniques represents dangerous experimentation with patient lives, Dr. Patterson added. Blake is essentially arguing that excellence in surgery is less important than predictability in outcomes. But the opposition faced a fundamental problem. They were arguing against evidence rather than presenting superior alternatives. Our techniques had achieved results that traditional surgery couldn't match, and no amount of institutional authority could override documented proof of patient outcomes. Walking through the hotel lobby after our meeting, I was struck by the unprecedented media presence at what had traditionally been an internal medical conference. News crews from around the world had gathered to cover what CNN was calling the battle for the future of heart surgery. The media narrative had evolved beyond medical innovation to encompass broader themes about institutional change, technological progress, and the courage required to challenge established systems. My story was being presented as an example of how individual excellence could transform entire industries when supported by evidence and driven by commitment to serving others. Dr. Vasquez, this conference has become about more than cardiac surgery, observed Jennifer Kim, our media coordinator, as we reviewed press coverage. You're being positioned as a symbol of innovation triumphing over institutional resistance, and that resonates with people facing similar challenges in their own fields. The international attention created pressure that extended far beyond the medical community. Government health officials, insurance executives, and patient advocacy groups were all watching to see whether the surgical establishment would embrace evidence-based change or retreat into defensive traditionalism. Perhaps the most emotionally significant moment of the pre-conference day came when Dr. James Rodriguez approached me in the hotel restaurant, accompanied by 3 other residents who had trained under my supervision during the difficult years at Metropolitan General. Dr. Vasquez, we wanted you to know that everything you taught us about innovation and patient care has shaped how we practice medicine, James said, his voice filled with emotion. You didn't just train us to be surgeons. You taught us to think beyond limitations and never accept that good enough is adequate when excellence is possible. The residents had all gone on to leadership positions at major medical centers, where they were implementing innovative techniques and training the next generation of surgeons. Their success represented the exponential impact of surgical innovation. Each surgeon we trained would influence hundreds of others throughout their careers. Elena, you need to understand the ripple effects of what you've accomplished, added Dr. Maria Santos, who was now Chief of Pediatric Cardiology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. There are surgeons practicing on every continent who trace their approach to techniques they learned from you or your trainees. The personal validation from colleagues who had witnessed my journey from institutional suppression to global recognition provided emotional strength for the challenges that lay ahead. Their presence reminded me that this conference wasn't just about defending innovation. It was about celebrating the transformation that occurs when excellence is given the freedom to flourish. Later that afternoon, I attended a gathering that had not been part of the official conference agenda but had emerged organically from the patient community. Families whose lives had been transformed by innovative cardiac surgery had traveled to San Francisco to ensure that the medical establishment heard directly from the people who benefited from surgical excellence. Sarah Chen, whose husband David had been saved by my unauthorized surgery 5 years earlier, had organized what she called the Patients First Coalition, a group of over 200 families who wanted to share their experiences with innovative versus traditional cardiac care. Dr. Vasquez, the surgeons in that conference hall need to hear from the people whose lives depend on their decisions, Sarah explained as we met in a hotel conference room filled with patients and families. They need to understand that this isn't an academic debate. It's about whether children grow up with their parents and whether grandparents live to see their grandchildren graduate. The stories shared by coalition members were both heartbreaking and inspiring. Timothy Morrison, the retired firefighter whose inoperable aneurysm had been repaired using innovative techniques, spoke about returning to coach Little League Baseball. Maria Gonzalez, the mother whose heart had been regenerated after postpartum cardiomyopathy, described watching her twins take their first steps without worrying that physical exertion might trigger cardiac arrest. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came from 16-year-old David Park, whose heart had been rebuilt after massive trauma. Dr. Vasquez didn't just save my life, he told the gathering. She gave me back my future. I'm going to medical school next year because I want to help other people the way she helped me. The evening before my presentation, Advanced Medical Technologies arranged a private demonstration of surgical equipment that had been developed specifically to support innovative cardiac procedures. The technology showcase felt like stepping into the future of medicine: robotic systems with precision measured in micrometers, imaging technology that could map cardiac function in real time, and surgical instruments that responded to thought commands. Elena, this equipment represents everything you've been working toward, Dr. Patterson explained as we toured the demonstration area. Surgeons using these systems will be able to perform your techniques with precision that exceeds even your current capabilities. The most impressive innovation was a fully integrated surgical suite that combined artificial intelligence, robotic assistance, and advanced imaging to create what engineers called precision surgery beyond human limitations. The system could analyze patient anatomy, plan optimal surgical approaches, and guide procedures with accuracy that eliminated many of the risks associated with traditional surgery. Dr. Vasquez, within 2 years, this technology will be available at medical centers worldwide, Dr. Chen added. Your techniques won't just be possible at specialized institutions, they'll be accessible wherever this equipment is installed. The technology preview demonstrated that surgical innovation was entering a new phase where advanced equipment would democratize access to excellent cardiac care. Surgeons wouldn't need decades of specialized training to perform procedures that currently required exceptional skill and experience. As the sun set over San Francisco Bay, I found myself alone in my hotel room, reviewing the presentation that would define the next chapter of cardiac surgery. The evidence was overwhelming. The support was unprecedented, and the momentum was unstoppable. Yet I also understood that tomorrow's presentation would determine whether the medical establishment embraced the future or retreated into institutional defensiveness. Dr. Blake and his supporters would make their last stand during the question period following my keynote address. They would argue that rapid change was dangerous, that traditional approaches were safer, and that the medical community should resist pressure to abandon proven methods for unvalidated innovations. But I also knew that their arguments would ring hollow when presented alongside evidence of superior patient outcomes, global support for surgical innovation, and technology that made excellence accessible rather than exceptional. The phone rang at 9:30 p.m., a call from Dr. Lisa Chen at Northwestern Memorial with news that would add even more significance to tomorrow's presentation. Elena, the American College of Surgeons Selection Committee has made their decision about the Surgeon of the Year award, she told me, her voice filled with excitement. They'll be announcing it immediately after your presentation tomorrow. Did they tell you the result? They said the decision was unanimous, but they want to maintain suspense until the official announcement. Elena, regardless of the award outcome, what you've accomplished has already transformed cardiac surgery forever. As I prepared for sleep, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 5 years earlier, I had been fighting to save individual patients despite institutional resistance. Tomorrow, I would be presenting evidence that could transform how cardiac surgery was practiced worldwide. With support from the highest levels of medical leadership and technology development, the stage was set for the most important medical presentation of my career. But now I would be speaking to an audience that was eager to embrace the future rather than defensive about the past. The evidence was overwhelming, the momentum was unstoppable, and the future of cardiac surgery was finally aligned with the interests of patients rather than institutional politics. In 12 hours, I would prove that excellence always finds a way to reveal itself, even when faced with the most entrenched resistance to change. The moment of destiny had arrived, and I was ready to embrace it completely. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.